And today we are learning about emotion and motivation, chapter 10. Lots of interesting stuff in here. Let's start by defining motivation. Motivation is the wants or needs that direct behavior toward a goal. So your motivation is your behavior moving towards a goal related to your wants or your needs. And motivation can be intrinsic or extrinsic. It's important to understand the difference. I put a little graphic. Intrinsic motivation comes because of interest or enjoyment in the task itself. Examples of intrinsic motivators are enjoyment, purpose, growth, curiosity, passion, self-expression, having fun. These are all intrinsic motivators. They come from within. Extrinsic motivators, on the other hand, are an outcome, something that comes from outside of you. Things like incentives like promotions, pay raises, bonuses, or benefits, prizes, winning something, a perk. Other extrinsic motivators can be things like power or fame, could be extrinsic motivators. Culture can influence motivation. For example, in collectivist cultures, it's common to do things for your family members because the emphasis is on the group. This is less common in individualistic cultures like the United States. So culture can definitely influence the type of things you're motivated to do. And I added this part on the bottom because I thought it was interesting to you folks as students. In educational settings, students are more likely to experience intrinsic motivation to learn when they feel a sense of belonging and respect in the classroom. This internalization can be enhanced if the evaluative aspects, like tests and grading, are de-emphasized, and if students feel that they exercise some control over the learning environment. So as you might imagine, intrinsic motivation is better. It makes you more motivated for a longer time. Intrinsic motivation is a better type of motivation, though there's nothing wrong with extrinsic motivation. But the goal is to be intrinsically motivated. And as a teacher, you want your students to be intrinsically motivated to learn. You don't want them only learning for the grades. You want them to learn because they want to learn, because they're interested or passionate or curious. So the way to get students to internalize their motivation is by de-emphasizing the grades and the tests and all that evaluation stuff and giving students some control over their learning environment. So hopefully I am doing that for you folks. Let's move on to a few theories about motivation. William James, who, as you may know, is the father of psychology, he theorized that behavior was driven by a number of instincts which aid survival. We've talked about instincts in previous chapters. An instinct is a species-specific pattern of behavior that is not learned. So birds are born knowing how to build a nest. Humans have the instinct to walk once they are able to. We all have different instincts. We even have an instinct to procreate. Different animals have different instincts, and James believed that motivation was all driven by instinct. However, more psychologists after him developed further theories because instincts, while they do explain a lot of motivation, they certainly don't explain all motivation or all behavior. So drive theory of motivation, this is an interesting one. It says that deviations from homeostasis creates physiological needs. These needs result in psychological drive states that direct behavior to meet the need. So remember that homeostasis is maintaining balance within your biological system or within a biological system. So when you deviate from the homeostasis, whether it's that you're deviating from the correct blood sugar so you feel hungry, or you're deviating from the correct balanced amount of water in your system, you're dehydrated and you feel thirsty. When the homeostasis of a biological system is set off, and it deviates, then it causes a psychological drive, a motivation to fix the need, to drink something if you're dehydrated or eat something if you're hungry. So drive theory makes a lot of sense, but similar to the instincts, it doesn't really explain all behavior or all types of motivation. So there are lots of other theories, but mostly I'd like you to be familiar with the drive theory of motivation and the Yerkes-Dodson law. Before I tell you about the Yerkes-Dodson law, let me explain what a habit is. Habit, of course, can mean several different things, but a habit of motivation results from the fact that once we have engaged in a behavior that successfully reduces our drive, right? Maybe our drive to reset the homeostasis of our blood sugar, so we eat something. Once we've eaten something and we successfully reduce that drive, we're more likely to engage in that behavior whenever faced with the drive in the future. So if our body realizes that we learn basically that eating increases our blood sugar when our blood sugar feels low, we may eat. So we create a habit of doing things to retain that level of homeostasis or reach that level of homeostasis again. All of that's about the drive theory. But moving on to Yerkes-Dodson law, it says that a simple task is performed best when arousal levels are relatively high, and a complex task is best performed when arousal levels are lower. So it's best to have a medium amount of arousal. Arousal means like how much your sympathetic nervous system is acting up, right? It could be a heart rate, it could be hunger or sexual arousal, or anything like that, or adrenaline being released. All of that causes arousal, and the best level is somewhat medium amount of arousal. But interestingly, when there's a simple task, it's better to be a little bit higher on the arousal level. And when there's a complex task, when there's something hard, it's better to be more calm about it. And I suppose that makes sense if you think about it. If you're just sweeping the kitchen, it's best to have that extra boost of energy because it's real easy to do. But if you need to focus on a difficult math problem, you may want to really calm yourself down and get into it. So that's Yerkes-Dodson law. We're not done with our theories. Just kidding. This next one's actually a good one too. And then we'll quickly talk about the hierarchy of needs, but I know you folks already know that one really well. Albert Bandura, he's the social modeling guy, if you remember him. He theorized that an individual's sense of self-efficacy plays a really important role in motivating behavior, in the behavior that, their motivating behavior. And motivation is derived from the expectations that we have about the consequences of our behavior. So self-efficacy is basically your belief in yourself, in your own capability to complete a task. So I put a picture of the little engine that could. She says, I think I can, and then she can. So Bandura says that we are motivated to do things that we think we can do. And we're less motivated or not motivated to do tasks that we don't think we'll be able to complete successfully. Which of course makes sense, though some people's personalities make them more up for a challenge, so to speak. So Bandura's self-efficacy theory says that we are motivated by our belief that we can do something. And then Maslow's hierarchy of needs, all about. We start with our biological needs. When those are met, we focus on our safety needs. Then we focus on our social needs, love and belonging. After that, our esteem needs, like respect and status. And when we finally reach the level of self-actualization, we can meet our full potential. So Maslow believed that our needs are our motivators. We're motivated by these needs, and we, of course, move up one level at a time as we meet each level. Now we're done with the theories of motivation. We're going to talk about a few different issues such as hunger and body weight and eating disorders. So hunger is when our stomachs are empty, right? When our blood sugar goes down or we haven't eaten enough, we're hungry. And there's several biological or physiological signals that are sent throughout our body to let our brain know that we're hungry. So one is that when our stomachs are empty, they contract. We can feel this in terms of hunger pangs. I don't know if you've ever been hungry enough that you feel those sharp pains in your stomach, but it can be quite painful when your stomach is contracting. So that would motivate somebody to eat and get rid of the pain. Also, chemical messages travel to the brain to serve as a signal to initiate feeding, right, to eat. And of course, this isn't just in humans, this is in all animals. Also, when our blood glucose levels drop, our blood sugar, both our pancreas and our liver generate a number of chemical signals to induce hunger. So all these different things, our stomach contractions, the chemicals, messages sent from our stomach, our glucose levels drop and messages are sent from our pancreas and liver, that lets us know that we're hungry and it's time to eat. Then we do eat and we experience something called satiation. I believe I said that right. Which is fullness or satisfaction, basically when you've eaten enough. And I'm sure we've all experienced when we continue eating past the level of satiation. And obviously that's not good, but if you're at a really good restaurant, once in a while you can indulge. So then once we eat and our blood sugar levels increase, the pancreas and liver send new signals that shut off hunger and let our brain know that we're full. And of course, that's a benefit of eating a little more slowly, is that you get that message that you're full before you put another bite in your mouth. And the food's passage through the gastrointestinal tract also sends signals to the brain, and the fat cells release a hormone called leptin, which sends signals. So all kinds of signals letting you know that you're full. This is just one example of a biological mechanism that motivates us, right? All of this happens to motivate us to eat. And many animals are motivated to feed or to hunt or find food, right? So let's talk about body weight a little bit. In general, if you consume more calories than you burn, you will store that excess energy, those extra calories, in the form of body fat. And on the other hand, if you consume fewer calories than you burn off, the stored fat will be converted to energy. So the way that you would gain weight would be to eat more calories than you burn, and the way to lose weight would be to eat less calories than you burn. But it's not quite that simple. Every body is a little bit different, and we each have our own metabolic rate. The metabolic rate is the amount of energy expended in a given period of time. So while it is true that you need to eat more calories than you burn to lose weight, I may burn a different number of calories in a day than you do, due to our variability in metabolic rates. So it's always true that eating more than you burn will cause weight gain and eating less than you burn will cause weight loss. But what varies from person to person is the metabolic rate, how fast you're burning that energy in the first place, how much you can burn in a day, how much you burn when you exercise, etc. So people with high rates of metabolism are able to burn off calories more easily than those with lower rates of metabolism. And of course, metabolism is just one of the reasons that people are overweight or underweight. A set point theory is very interesting. The set point theory says that each individual has an ideal body weight, which is resistant to change. A lot of people find when they're trying to lose weight or even gain weight that they get stuck at a certain weight. Sometimes it's called a plateau. It means you're having a hard time breaking that weight, and often it's because it's your set point. It's a genetically predetermined weight that your body's kind of stuck at. And with work, you can change it, but usually it's not necessary. However, there are issues sometimes that arise, or disorders, such as Prader-Willi syndrome, PWS, which is a genetic disorder that results in persistent feelings of intense hunger and reduced rates of metabolism. So people with PWS feel hungry almost all the time. They want to eat huge amounts of food, and they have a reduced metabolism. So as you can imagine, this results in obesity. The symptoms can also include developmental delays, excessive eating like we talked about, and cognitive deficits. So it's not just a syndrome about metabolism and being overweight. It's related to cognitive things as well. If you've ever seen those little kids on the talk shows with the weight disorders, most of them have PWS. Moving on to BMI. The book talks all about the BMI, the body mass index. It's based on your height and your weight. And the book tells you that if your BMI is more than 30, you're obese. And if it's more than 40, you're morbidly obese. And if it's less than 20, you're underweight, and you can be dangerously underweight. But BMI is famous for being very inaccurate. There's very few doctors on earth who care about BMI or will even look at your BMI chart anymore. It's pretty accepted that BMI is kind of junk. It doesn't really tell you much about your actual fat content in your body or how healthy you are. The BMI is not accurate because it does not take into account muscle mass. Remember, muscle weighs a lot more than fat, bone density, your overall body composition, and then racial and sex differences. There is a different BMI chart for males and females, but it doesn't really, and it doesn't take into account if you've had children, if women have had children before. So basically, if you Google BMI, you're just going to find a bunch of articles saying that it's junk. And one good example to show you that it's kind of not the most accurate measure of health or of body fat is that when Arnold Schwarzenegger was bodybuilding, his BMI was 33, which put him in the obese category. And I think we would all agree that Arnold Schwarzenegger was not obese. He just weighed a lot for his height, so his BMI made him seem like he was obese. Just one example of why BMI is not a good measure of health or body fat. Let's move on to eating disorders. The pink box on the left talks about a lot of the health complications related to anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating. I'll let you read those yourself, but let me explain real quick what the 3 different eating disorders are in case you don't know. Anorexia is a cycle of self-starvation, and it forces the body to shut down because it needs to conserve energy. So people who are anorexic often have a body dysmorphic disorder where they see themselves differently than everybody else does. People with anorexia starve themselves. They often exercise way too much, and it's very, very unhealthy. And it's more common in females, but it does happen in males as well. 5% of anorexia cases are males. And it has a high morbidity rate, a very high mortality rate of passing away if you have anorexia. On the top right, the statistic tells us that the mortality rate associated with anorexia is 12 times higher than the regular mortality rate for females between the ages of 15 and 24. So if a teenager has anorexia, they're 12 times more likely to die than their peers. Obviously, that's really not healthy, and there are a lot of psychological issues involved with eating disorders, but we're not going to get into all of that today. Moving on to bulimia. Bulimia is a pattern of binge eating and purging. So people who struggle with bulimia eat large amounts, they binge eat, and then they purge. They make themselves throw up to get rid of all the calories. And often these people don't end up dangerously underweight like the people with anorexia, but there are a lot of health complications like electrolyte issues and damage to their teeth and esophagus and all of that from the constant vomiting. On the right side, it shows that 25% of college-aged women have engaged in binging and purging as a weight management technique. That's a huge amount. And down on the bottom, it shows males versus females. So for anorexia, there's 5% male, but for bulimia, it goes up to 20% of bulimia cases are males. And then binge eating is a little bit different than bulimia. Actually, it's quite different than bulimia because there's no purging involved. Binge eating often results in a lot of weight gain and has all of the health complications of obesity. People who binge eat, it's different than just people who overeat. Binge eating is more of it has triggers that set it off in their episodes where they eat a tremendous amount of food. And binge eating is actually 50-50 male and females who partake in that. So females are not more likely to struggle with binge eating, but they are more likely to struggle with bulimia and anorexia. Moving on from food and weight and eating, we are ready to talk about sexual behavior. The good news is you don't need to learn about the biology of it. It is very interesting. Feel free to read it in the book and click the supplementary links, but I won't be testing you on the biology of sexual behavior. The picture on the right shows the sexual response cycle, which some of our researchers who we talk later will tell us, or I'll tell you about it when we talk about the researchers. But as you can see, it starts with the excitement period, a plateau, orgasm, and resolution. This is also explained in your book if you're curious about more details of the different parts of the cycle. I do want to talk about sex research, and before I start, I'll tell you something interesting about myself. What brought me to Hawaii from Canada is sex research. If you see that friendly looking lady down in the bottom right corner, that is Dr. Elaine Hatfield, one of the most famous sex researchers of all time. She still works at UH in Manoa, and she's the reason that I came here to Hawaii, because she agreed to supervise my research. I was very interested in sex research at the time, and it was a huge honor for her to agree to work with me. So I moved and I came all the way here, and then I met my husband and stayed. But Elaine Hatfield is the reason that I came here to study love and sex. I'll tell you more about her in a moment. First, let's talk about Alfred Kinsey. You may have heard of Kinsey or seen the movie about him. He worked at Indiana University, and back in the 40s, he conducted this huge, large-scale survey about sexual behavior. And a lot of people were very surprised or shocked by the results. He found that a lot more people than we had expected engaged in homosexual behaviors and masturbation and all sorts of things that people didn't really talk about back then. Lots of different kinks and behaviors that were not normal back then, and people did not talk about, and people were very surprised to see the results. On the bad side, Kinsey's research has been criticized that it was not very scientific at all. He had sampling errors and statistical errors. It was not a scientific study, but it did really open people's eyes to all of this stuff that was happening behind closed doors. And he paved the way for future sex researchers like Masters and Johnson and Hatfield. Excuse me. So Masters and Johnson were a little bit different than Kinsey. They started researching a decade or so later, and they actually observed people having sex. They observed people having sex and masturbating. So rather than using personal interviews, they really did use science. They recorded things like blood pressure and breathing rate, all different physiological measurements while people were engaging in sexual behavior. So this was the first time that sex was really scientifically studied by psychologists. So Masters and Johnson were very important in paving the way. And right around the same time, Elaine Hatfield sort of took the stage from Kinsey, and she was on the Barbara Walters show and Phil Donahue, and she was on the ABC News and all these TV shows. She was really a mainstream sex researcher for the first time. She ended up being the chair of psychology at the University of Hawaii. She was also the president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality. And in 2012, she received the Lifetime of Science Achievement Award from the Association for Psychological Science. Oh, I made a typo in her name. It says Hayfield. Hatfield has appeared on all those shows I just talked about. So she's a very famous sex researcher, and she works closely with her husband, Dr. Rapson, in studying things like emotional contagion, which I'll talk a lot more about when we get to the social psychology chapter. But for now, we're just worrying about her sex research. So she was born in 1937. Her first article, which was titled Interpersonal Attraction, was published in 1969, and she is still working today as a professor of psychology at UH Manoa. I remember her classes very well. I enjoyed working with her so much. Moving on from sex research to sexual orientation, and we'll talk about gender identity in a moment. The book does define sexual orientation, but I chose to grab a definition from the Human Rights Campaign website. The definition there of sexual orientation is an inherent or immutable, meaning unchangeable, enduring, emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to other people. That's your sexual orientation. I like that it doesn't give binary options. It leaves everything open. Research suggests, or basically tells us, that sexual orientation has an underlying biological component, and there is no credible evidence at all, no science, to suggest that individuals could change their sexual orientation. So it's widely accepted that sexual orientation cannot be changed. And a man named Robert Spitzer, who for a long time was publishing and talking about conversion therapy, trying to convert homosexual people to be heterosexual, and he eventually admitted that he had been lying and made mistakes and apologized in a public letter. But focusing on somebody more positive than him, we have this beautiful lady at the bottom, Marsha Johnson. I didn't know much about her. I actually spent a little while reading about her today. She was an activist, a drag performer, a sex worker, and a model for Andy Warhol. She was Black, queer, and trans, and fearlessly advocated for her rights and the rights of the LGBTQ community at a time when doing so put her safety in jeopardy. That quote is from the Global Citizen, and if you Google Marsha Johnson Global Citizen, you can find the article. There's a lot of interesting stuff about her on the internet, and legend has it that she threw the first brick at Stonewall. So she is a famous LGBTQ activist. I found this list of definitions of different sexualities on the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh website. I just took a screenshot. I put it on here. This will not be on any quizzes or exams, but if anybody wants to read these definitions, feel free to pause the video and do so. I will move on to gender identity. Two of my favorite girls over here, Jazz Jennings and Laverne Cox. Gender identity is an individual's sense of being male or female. Sometimes it's a hard thing to really understand when your gender identity matches your sex at birth. It's not as obvious what gender identity really is. But after talking to transgender people and reading their testimonies and watching their several documentaries, from my understanding at least, it's something that when there is a mismatch, that's when you really start to notice your gender identity. Though we all have a gender identity, and sometimes it's not male or female. It can be on a spectrum, or it can be no gender at all. Gender dysphoria, I'll talk about real quick, and then I have some neat statistics and quotes. Gender dysphoria is technically the diagnostic category in the DSM-5, which is a diagnostic manual for psychologists, and that's the newest version. And it's for individuals who do not identify as the gender associated with their biological sex. So not all people who have a different gender identity than their biological sex experience gender dysphoria, but some do, a lot do. I'm not sure of any statistics, but a lot of people whose inside gender identity does not match their outward biological sex, a lot of these people experience gender dysphoria. And a lot of the time the diagnosis of gender dysphoria is what allows them to get the medical procedures that they want. So here are some interesting statistics. Research studies indicate that the majority of millennials, people aged 18 to 34, regard gender as a spectrum instead of a strict male-female binary. Of course, older people have a more old-fashioned perspective, but it's good that younger people are getting it, that it's more of a spectrum. 12% of millennials identify as transgender or gender non-conforming, so non-binary or something like that. And more than half of people ages 13 to 20 know somebody who uses a gender-neutral pronoun, such as they or them. And of course, if you should meet someone who asks you to use a gender-neutral pronoun, you should. And if you're not sure what pronoun to use, the best thing to do is to ask politely. Jazz Jennings is a transgender teenager, although I believe she's 20 now, and she recently got into Harvard. She has a TV show on TLC that I will admit I watch a lot of TLC reality, but they actually did a great job, I think, of the show I Am Jazz, if you're interested in watching that. She also has a book called Being Jazz, as well as a children's book called I Am Jazz that I read to my kids, and they enjoyed it. I'm going to read you the two quotes by Laverne Cox, and we'll move on to our next topic. She says most trans folks don't have the privileges Caitlyn and I now have. She's referring to Caitlyn Jenner. It is those trans folks we must continue to lift up, get them access to health care, jobs, housing, safe streets, safe schools, and homes for our young people. So she's pointing out that even though society is a lot more accepting of transgender people than we used to be, there are a lot of people out there still struggling, and those are the people who we need to lift up, who we need to protect with legislation, or we need to support and keep safe. Her other quote says, "The preoccupation with transition and with surgery objectifies trans people. And then we don't get to deal with the real lived experiences. The reality of trans people's lives is that so often we're targets of violence. We experience discrimination disproportionately to the rest of the community. When we focus on transition, we don't actually get to talk about those things." Laverne Cox. So actually, when I read this quote from her is when I decided that we don't need to talk about the hormone therapy and the surgeries. If you're interested, the book goes over it real quickly, and the show I Am Jazz actually goes into a lot of detail about the medical side. But I see Laverne's point in saying that we need to talk first about the people who are being murdered, the people who are being bullied, the people who don't have a safe home to go to. We can satisfy our curiosity about their surgeries later. All right, we are done with the sexuality and gender part of this chapter, and we are on to our last subtopic, which is emotion. Emotion is a subjective state of being that we often describe as our feelings. Emotions result from the combination of subjective experience, expression, cognitive appraisal, and physiological responses. But as you'll see when we talk about the theories of emotion, the researchers really kind of disagree on the order that these things happen in: our experience, our cognitive appraisal, and our physiological responses. Emotions are consciously experienced and intentional, as opposed to a mood, which is prolonged, less intense, and it's an affective state that doesn't occur in response to something we experience. So if you're in a bad mood, it's not because something bad happened to you. Whereas if you're feeling the emotion of sadness, it's likely because something sad happened. So there's 6 emotions that I showed down here, although we'll talk about 7 a little bit later. There's happiness, sadness, fear, disgust, anger, and surprise. And if you notice, the title of my slides is the movie Inside Out, which talks a lot about these different emotions. Okay, theories of emotion. James Lange theory of emotion is that emotions arise from our physiological arousal. First, our heart rate goes up or something happens physically, and then we feel the emotion. The Cannon-Bard theory says that physiological and emotional happen at the same time. They're independent from each other, but they happen at the same time. Your heart rate goes up and you feel scared at the same time, although they're independent processes. The facial feedback hypothesis is, I think this one's a cool one, that facial expression can affect your emotional experience. In other words, smiling can make you happier and frowning can make you sadder. And this is actually, there's quite a bit of evidence supporting this hypothesis. It's pretty much an accepted fact that smiling can increase your happiness and frowning can make you more sad. And there's some research on it that they discuss in the textbook. The Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotion is a little trickier, but bear with me. It says that the physiological arousal is interpreted in context to produce an emotional experience. So if your heart rate goes up, depending on the context, you may feel excited, you may feel scared, you may feel surprised. It depends on the context. This one makes sense to me. So physiological arousal, those feelings like your increased heart rate or sweating, it's very similar across different types of emotion. Even when you're happy, you may sweat or get increased heart rate. So therefore, it's our cognitive appraisal of the situation which is critical to the actual emotion we experience. I hope that makes sense. It's sort of a situation or environmentally dependent theory. So your heart rate goes up, but you don't always feel scared from it because it depends on the situation. And they talk about an interesting research study in the textbook as well, where they inject epinephrine, I believe, to give people a state of arousal. Moving on to cognitive mediational theory. That one tells us that our emotions are determined by our appraisal of the stimulus rather than the context. This one really emphasizes the cognitive process. Don't worry too much about understanding that one. The book doesn't explain it that well. Just know that the cognitive mediational theory emphasizes cognition. And finally, this one's not a theory, but automatic emotion regulation, or AER, is the non-deliberate control of our emotions. When we try to make ourselves less nervous so we can make a speech, or less happy so we can be appropriate when we walk into the funeral or whatever it is. And this can be adaptive or maladaptive. It can be a good thing or a bad thing. So what all of these theories have in general is this little picture here on the bottom is that we pay attention to a stimulus, there's some sort of interpretation and then a reaction. And somewhere in there we feel our emotions. But as you can see, there's not really a concrete answer to how emotions arise or exactly what causes emotions or the whole process of it. However, there is some information on the biology of emotion. I really broke it down as simply as possible here, and whatever's on this slide is all you need to know about the biology of emotion. The hypothalamus plays a role in the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. That's the one that makes your heartbeat go up or your sweat glands start to produce sweat. And that activation of the sympathetic nervous system is a part of any given emotional reaction. So the hypothalamus is involved in emotion because it activates our sympathetic nervous system. The thalamus serves as a sensory relay center whose neurons project to both the amygdala and higher cortical regions for further processing. It's sort of a middleman for our emotion between our sensory information and our perception of it. The amygdala is an important one. It plays an important part. It plays a role in processing our emotional information and then sending that information on. And a lot isn't quite understood about it yet, but we do know that it plays a role in processing emotional information. And finally, the hippocampus integrates our emotional experience with our cognition, our memories, or our language. I gave one example of a research study on the right side under the picture. I thought this was interesting. Rat pups, or rat babies, who experienced abuse during their childhood, I guess, when they were small, when they were young, were much more likely to exhibit depressive-like symptoms during adolescence when compared to controls, compared to rats who did not experience abuse. And these depressive-like behaviors were associated with increased activation of the amygdala. So baby rats who are abused are way more likely to have depression or depressive symptoms during their adolescence, and they also have increased activation in their amygdala. Similarly, changes in amygdala structure and function have been found in human adolescents who are either at risk or diagnosed with depression or anxiety. So one thing we do know is that the amygdala is related to depression in some way, shape, or form. We are on our last slide before the summary. Sorry this got long. These are our 7 universal emotions which we can recognize in a facial expression. Even people in other cultures, even blind people make these faces, even though they've never seen them before. They're universal emotions associated with these specific facial expressions. A cultural display rule is a culturally specific standard governing the types and frequencies of displaying your emotion. So everybody on earth makes these same faces when they feel happy or sad or surprised or contempt, but different cultures will dictate when we can show those expressions. So for example, Americans are more likely to show fear, anger, and disgust in public. Somebody from an Asian culture may or does show the exact same facial expression for fear or disgust. They just do it in private. And as I mentioned, can generally blind individuals who have never seen anybody else's facial expressions before still make these same faces when they're feeling happiness, surprise, sadness, fright, disgust, contempt, and anger. So that's why they are universal across cultures and across people who have not seen others doing it. All right, time for our summary. Feel free to stop and come back before the test. Motivation is our wants or needs that direct behavior towards a goal. Intrinsic motivation is based on our internal feelings like purpose, curiosity, passion. Extrinsic motivation comes from external factors or rewards, such as money, praise, or power. An instinct is a species-specific pattern of behavior that is not learned, and a lot of motivation does arise from our instincts. The drive theory of motivation tells us that deviations from homeostasis create physiological needs, and these needs result in psychological drive states that direct our behavior. Remember that homeostasis is the maintaining balance within a biological system. So when this is set off, like our blood sugar goes down, we become driven to find food. A habit is once we've engaged in a behavior to reduce one of those drives, we're more likely to engage in that behavior again. It's a type of learning. The Yerkes-Dodson law tells us that a simple task is performed best when arousal levels are relatively high, but a complex task is best performed when arousal levels are relatively low. But both of them are still medium levels of arousal, just higher for simple tasks and lower for hard tasks. Self-efficacy was explained by Albert Bandura. It's a belief in your own capability or capacity to complete a task. And Bandura believed that we are motivated by our belief in our own capabilities. Maslow's hierarchy of needs tells us we're motivated first by our biological needs, then safety, then social esteem, and finally our self-actualization needs. When we're hungry, we are driven to find food, and once we do and we eat, we experience satiation, which is fullness or satisfaction. Every person has a different metabolic rate, or there's a lot of variance in metabolic rates, and what that is the amount of energy you expend in a given period of time. So how fast you burn calories is your metabolic rate or your metabolism. And set point theory tells us that each individual has an ideal body weight or set point that is resistant to change. It's hard to go above or below that set body weight, usually harder to go below. Moving on to eating disorders. Anorexia nervosa is an eating disorder characterized by low body weight, and this is achieved through starvation and or excessive exercise. Bulimia nervosa is a type of eating disorder characterized by binge eating followed by purging, so eating large amounts at one time and then vomiting afterwards. Binge eating disorder, however, is different than bulimia because there's no purging. Binge eating disorder is characterized by binge eating and associated distress. So the distress can be a trigger or a result of the binge eating, or both. The sexual response cycle we just discussed real quickly has 4 phases: excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. You can read more about the phases in your book. Kinsey was the first sex researcher from Indiana. He published Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female in 1948 and 53, respectively. And he really paved the way for further sex researchers. He conducted his research through surveys, so it wasn't very scientific, but it was groundbreaking. Elaine Hatfield published her first article, Interpersonal Attraction, in 1969. She wrote a book called Love and Sex, and more recently another book about love and sex, and she works right here in Hawaii at UH. Sexual orientation is an inherent or immutable, enduring emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to other people, and the different sexual orientations are defined on that slide with the white background further back. You can go look at that. Marsha Johnson is a famous transgender LGBTQ advocate. Gender identity is an individual's sense of being male or female. Gender dysphoria is the diagnostic category for individuals who do not who experience distress because of not identifying as the gender associated with their biological sex. So not everybody transgender experiences gender dysphoria, but it is quite common. Emotion is defined as a subjective state of being. Emotions are often described as feelings. The James Lange theory of emotion, tells us that emotions arise from physiological arousal. So first our heart rate goes up, then we feel scared. Cannon-Bard theory of emotion says it happens at the same time. We feel scared and our heart rate increases together and or at the same time but independently. The facial feedback hypothesis hypothesizes and has a lot of support for facial expression affecting our emotional experience. For example, smiling can make you happier. Try it. The Schachter-Singer two-factor model, or two-factor theory of emotion, I'm getting tired, says that the physiological arousal is interpreted in context to produce the emotional experience. This is an interesting one, and it makes a lot of sense that when your heart rate goes up, if you're faced with a snake, you're going to feel scared. If your heart rate goes up because you're exercising, you probably won't feel scared. You interpret the context. AER, or automatic emotion regulation, is our automatic or non-deliberate control of our emotions. And finally, the 7 universal facial expressions that are made by people all over the world, even blind people, include happiness, surprise, sadness, fright, disgust, contempt, and anger.